In this video, I'm going to talk about percents, and then we're going to talk about how to do percent conversions. So we're going to start by looking at the word percent, and percent literally means per hundred or for every hundred or hundredths. So 1%, for example, means one for every hundred, and you can write it as a fraction. We can also write it as a decimal. So the hundredths place is the second number to the right of the decimal, and so 1% is 1/100th, so we could put a 1 in the hundredths place, and then a 0 in the tenths place as a placeholder. So 0.01 is the same thing as 1/100th as a fraction, or 1%. So all three of these numbers represent the same quantity, they're just different ways to write it. And so it's helpful to know how to convert between these different types of numbers. And so we're going to do 4 conversions here, and I'm going to use 35% as an example as we go through these conversions. So with the first one, percent to decimal, I'm going to take 35% and I'm going to drop the percentage sign. So I'm going to write 35, and then I'm going to move the decimal point 2 places to the left. And you might be asking, well, where's the decimal point? I don't see it. Well, it's always to the right of the number if it's not written in. And so you can write it in this case, and then we're going to move it 2 places to the left to give us 0.35. So 35% is the same thing as 0.35. And then if you like an alternate way to do this, and this way is nice because this actually shows us why we're moving the decimal place to the left. Another way to think of this is you can divide this number by 100. So you can drop the percentage sign and get 35, and then take 35 divided by 100. Or we could write it as a fraction, or like this. And whenever you divide by a multiple of 10, so in this case 100 is a multiple of 10, that moves the decimal 2 places left, because there's 2 zeros here. If we were dividing by 10, it would move it 1 place left. If we were dividing it by 1,000, it'd move it 3 places left. And so you can really think of it either way. You can just, remember to move the decimal 2 places left, or if you'd rather just divide by 100, that'll work too. And so now if we go from percent to fraction, so I'm going to take 35% and I'm going to try to write this as a fraction. So step 1 is we drop the percentage sign, so I write 35, and then we put the number over 100. So we put 35 over 100, and then we're going to reduce the fraction. Sometimes once we put it over 100, we're done. So like if you had 17%, for example, you'd write 17 over 100, and then you'd be done, because you can't reduce that anymore. 17 and 100 don't have any common factors. 35 and 100 do have common factors. They both have a factor of 5. So I can divide both of those numbers by 5. 35 divided by 5 is 7, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. And then I want to try to do it again. I ask myself, well, do 7 and 20 have any common factors? They don't. And so at that point, I'm done, and I say 7/20 is the reduced fraction equivalent of 35%. If you're not great with reducing fractions, you can rely on a calculator. So depending on the type of calculator you have, there's some calculators will reduce for you, some will not. I'll show you how to reduce on a TI-34. This is also the same as a TI-30 in terms of the steps. So you can hit the N over D button, and you can type in 35. Whoop, too many 5s there. We're going to delete that extra 5, and I'm going to arrow down to put it over 100. Oh, got fast fingers today. Okay, and then we're going to get out of the fraction by hitting the right arrow, so the cursor comes out of the fraction, and then hit the simplify button, and then enter. And it shows you what the factor is that they divided out. So they divided both by a factor of 5, which is the same as what I just did, and got 7/20. And then if you're using the calculator, I would hit the simplify button again keep hitting it until you see factor of 1. That means the fraction can't be reduced anymore. They just divided each number by 1 because there isn't a larger factor to divide it by. So that's just confirmation that you're finished, and 7/20 is the most reduced form. And so the other calculator that can help you is a TI-83 or 84. And for that calculator, you would just type in 35 divided by 100. And then you're going to hit the math button and then enter. And that will reduce that for you. And so this is a TI 83 or 84, a graphing calculator. And then if you don't have either one of those calculators, you can do it by hand like I just showed you. And so then the next one, decimal to percent. So I'm going to take 0.35 And I'm going to move the decimal. All I have to do is go backwards. So this is opposite of this first one. So to go from percent to decimal, I move the decimal 2 places to the left. So if I want to go the other way around, all I need to do is move the two places to the right. So I write 0.35, and then I'm going to move my decimal 2 places to the right to get 35, and then I add a percent sign. And just like this first one, I said moving the decimal 2 places left was also equivalent to dividing by 100, while moving it 2 places to the right is equivalent to multiplying the decimal by 100. So you've got a couple of different ways to think about it. Either one will work. And so lastly, let's do fraction to a percent. And so I'm going to take my fraction 35 over 100, and I'm going to, there's two steps here. The first step is divide the numerator by the denominator. So I'm going to take 35 and I'm going to divide it by 100. And then I'm going to get 0.35. Okay, so that was step one. And then step two is I'm going to convert that decimal to a percent by moving the decimal 2 places to the right, or really we're just multiplying by 100, and then I'm going to add a percent sign. So step two is I'm going to move that decimal 2 places to the right and get 35, and then I add a percent. So I went from the fraction to a percentage. And we could have even taken a reduced fraction. So just to show you how that would work, 7/20ths, if I would have taken 7 divided by 20, you also get 0.35, because remember 7/20ths is the same as 35 over 100 and is the same as 0.35. And then same thing as above, move your decimal 2 places right. We would have gotten 35% with that fraction as well, since they represent the same number. So let's do a couple more examples. So with this first example, we're going to convert each percent to a decimal and a fraction. So for 85%, to convert it to a decimal, I'm going to drop the decimal, or drop the percentage sign. So I'm going to write 85. I'm going to write in a decimal point if I don't see one. So I'm going to put one at the end of the number. I'm going to move the decimal 2 places to the left, which remember is the same thing as dividing by 100. So 85 divided by 100, and I'm going to get 0.85, and that's the decimal equivalent of 85%. And then for the fraction, I'm going to drop my percent sign and I'm going to write 85 over 100, and then I'm going to reduce. And so in this case, both of these numbers are divisible by 5. 85 divided by 5 is 17. 100 divided by 5 is 20. 17 and 20 don't have any common factors, so I'm finished. And 17 over 20 is the correct answer. And then I can show you with a calculator real quick. So if I hit the N over D button, you could punch in 17 on the top and then 20 on the bottom. And then I could simplify. And it shows us there's a factor of 1. And actually, I should have put the 85 over 100. Let me show you that real quick. 85 over 100. We come out of the fraction, hit simplify, and then we get the 17 over 20. And then again, I just keep hitting simplify until I see that factor of 1, which means that it's the most reduced form. So that's a way to use a TI 3430 to check your answer. So now let's look at the second one. So this is different because we've got a percentage with a decimal place, a decimal point in the percentage. And so for the decimal, I'm going to remove the percent sign. So I write 37.5, and I either divide it by 100 or I move that decimal place 2 places to the left. So that just means dividing by 100. And I get 0.375. And if you want to put a 0 in the front, you can. It's not necessary though. And that's your decimal equivalent. And then for the fraction, you're going to take the number without the percentage sign, so 37.5, and write it over 100. The only thing is with this question is you have to do one more step that we haven't done before, and we have to get rid of that decimal point in the fraction. You don't ever want to have a decimal point inside of a fraction, and so with either number, numerator or denominator. So if you do, there's a trick, a really easy trick that can get rid of this decimal place, and all you have to do is multiply by a factor of 10. And every place that you want to move that decimal, so in this case I want to move it 1 place to the right to get rid of it, I'm going to multiply by 10. If I needed to move it 2 places to the right, I'd multiply it by 100. Um, and so whatever I do to the top, I also have to do to the bottom to keep the fraction proportional or the same. And so multiplying 37.5 times 10 gives me 375. So that help me get rid of that decimal place. And then 100 times 10 is just 1,000. And if you were to take a calculator and do 37.5 divided by 100, you get the same decimal as if you did 375 divided by 1,000. So we're not changing the number, we're just changing how it looks. And so then at this point, you're going to have to reduce it. And there's several ways you can reduce this. If you look at these numbers and you can see that they have a common factor, the biggest common factor is 15. So if you divide these both by 15, you end up getting 3/8, and that's the most simplified answer. Another way to do it, if maybe it's definitely possible to look at these numbers and not see a factor of 15, but maybe you just try and divide both by 5. That's okay too. You get 75 over 200. And then I can divide these by 5. So 75 divided by 5 is 15 over 40. And then those are divisible by 5. And you end up getting 3/8 that way. So it doesn't matter which way you reduce, either way will give you the same answer. And then you can also, just like before, you can use your N over D button if you have one, and you can type in 375 over 1,000. It doesn't like it when you put in the decimal place, so you do have to get rid of that decimal point before you use your calculator. And then hit simplify. And then it did exactly what we did down here. It divided it by 5. I'm going to hit simplify again. Divided numerator and denominator by 5. I'm going to hit simplify again. I'm going to keep hitting simplify until I see a factor of 1. And there we go. And so we've got 3/8, and that just confirms we did it correctly. And so lastly, let's look at 0.03%. And so to get a decimal for that, I'm going to write down the number without the percent sign, and I'm going to move that decimal 2 places to the left. And remember, that's the same thing as taking 0.03 and dividing by 100. And I'm going to put a placeholder here. So I end up getting 0.0003. And if you want to throw a 0 in front of the decimal, you can. It's not necessary. They mean the same thing, with or without this 0 on the left. And that's your decimal equivalent of 0.03%. And then for a fraction, I'm going to take the number, I'm going to drop the percentage sign, and I'm going to take the number 0.03 and write it over 100. And then just like the last problem, I don't want this decimal point in my fraction. And so I need to move it 2 places to the left to get, or I'm sorry, to the right to get rid of it, which is essentially the same as multiplying by 100. And so if I multiply the top by 100, then I've got to multiply the bottom by 100. And look, 100 over 100 is just 1. So really this is like me multiplying this fraction by 1. That's how I can get away with doing this. And so moving the decimal 2 places to the right gives me a 3 on the top, and then on the bottom it gives me a 1 with 4 zeros. And then 3 and 1,000 don't have any common factors. That's the most reduced version of the fraction. So 3 over 1,000 is the same thing as 0.03%. And if you look at this decimal, just to kind of go back to place values, the place values are the tenths place, hundredths place, thousands place, 10,000s place. Oh, and you know what? I just caught a mistake. 10,000s place. It's the benefit of doing a problem in more than one way, because I realized here I should have had 4 zeros on the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros. And so it should be 3 over 10,000. And looking at the decimal, tenths, hundredths, thousands, 10,000s, that matches up. So 3 over 10,000 should be your fraction answer there. So let's look at the next set of examples. So convert each to a percent, and then if needed, round to the hundredths place. So we'll remember that at the end. And so to take this decimal and to convert to a percent, I am going to multiply it by 100, which is the same thing as taking the decimal and moving it 2 places to the right. So I get 47.2, and then I'm going to put a percent sign. And then we don't need to round to the hundredths place in this case, because remember, the hundredths place is the second number after the decimal place, and since I don't have one here, we're finished. 1.03, I'm going to take that number and I'm going to move the decimal 2 spots to the right. That's the same thing as multiplying the number by 100, and I get 103%. No need to round there either because I don't have any numbers to the right of the decimal. And then lastly, with this problem, I'm going to take this decimal place and I'm going to move it 2 spots to the right, which is the same thing as multiplying the number by 100. So I get 3.567%. Now in this case, I do need to round because I do have a hundredths place, and that 6 is in the hundredths place. So I'm going to look to the right, and because that's a 7, it tells me to bump that 6 up to a 7. So I'm going to write 3.57, and then everything to the right becomes a 0, and I can leave that 0 off. It's not necessary to write it in. So it's going to be 3.57%. And so always make sure that when you're rounding here, we're converting it to a percent first and then we round. So we round after we convert. So round after we convert to a percent. Okay. So now we have 3 more examples here. And we're going to convert each of these fractions to a percentage, and then if needed, round to the nearest tenths place. And so for 7/8, remember fractions, this fraction bar indicates division. So this just means 7 divided by 8. So you can take a calculator and divide 7 divided by 8, and you're going to get the decimal 0.875. And then we want to convert it to a percent, so we're going to multiply it by 100 or move that decimal 2 spots to the right, which is the same thing as multiplying by 100, and we get 87.5%. And then there's no need to round since we only have a tenths place there. We don't have a hundredths place that would change that at all. And so this next one, 5/4, we're going to take 5 divided by 4 in a calculator. We get 1.25, and then we're going to take the decimal and move it 2 spots to the right or multiply it by 100, and we get 125%. Again, no need to round this one since there is no tenths place. And then 5/6, we're going to take 5 divided by 6. In this one, I want to show you what it looks like in the calculator. So if we do 5 divided by 6, we end up getting a repeating decimal. And so I'm going to write that down on the paper, 0.83333. I'm going to put a ... since that goes on forever. I like to write as many digits as I can. That way when I convert it to a percent, I've got plenty of numbers to work with. So I divided the 5 and 6, and then I'm going to convert it to a percent by moving this decimal 2 spots to the right, which is the same thing as multiplying that decimal by 100. And actually, if you have that decimal in your calculator, you can just right away say times 100, whoops, not 1,000, enter. And then you've got 83.3333 or 83.3 repeating. So I'm going to write 83.3333. It keeps on going, percent. And so we're asked to round to the nearest tenths place. So just like part C above, we're going to first convert to a percent, and then we're going to round. And so now we're going to round to the nearest tenths place. So I look at the, whoops, that's not the tenths place, that's the hundredths place. So I look at the nearest, or I look at the tenths place, which is this first 3, and I look to the right of that 3, and since there's a 3 after it, that tells me to leave the 3 alone. And so this is going to round to 83.3%. So just like the last problem, just make sure you write down you're going to round after converting to a percent. So you convert to a percent first, and then you're going to round.